Steve Meehan for the Kent Pilot. John R. Lewis died last week. The civil rights leader and long-serving United States congressman from Georgia was 80. Born in Troy, Alabama, he served as chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, in the 1960s. He organized the 1963 March on Washington and led the 1965 Selma to Montgomery marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. After previous unsuccessful attempts, Lewis was elected in 1986 to represent Georgia's 5th congressional district and was serving his 17th term at the time of his death. We are joined by Wayne T. Gilchrest, who represented the Maryland 1st Congressional District as a Republican from 1991 until 2009. During that time, he was a colleague and friend of John R. Lewis. Congressman, welcome to the Kent Pilot.
Thank you, Steve. It's good to be here.
John Lewis was a storied civil rights figure even before he came to Congress. When were you first aware of John Lewis on the national stage?
I think I recall John Lewis in the 1960s, especially the bridge incident, 1965, when I was in the Marine Corps. And in '65, I was stationed in North Carolina. So the civil rights movement was full blown at the time. Those men were in the news. And so when I got to Congress in 1991, I had to some extent already known about, in the way that you would know about Frederick Douglass, that's the way I knew about John Lewis.
Now that changed a little bit when you got to Washington. It wasn't necessarily civil rights that was something that brought you together, but poultry. And talk about your work on poultry with Congressman Lewis.
John was an easy person to know. He was an easy person to be a friend with because he was about one of the most genuine people that I have ever known who was committed to the words, the hallowed words of the Declaration of Independence. So we would have different conversations about a lot of things. And he was just a kind gentleman. And when John realized that I had a huge poultry industry in my district, he wanted to talk about it because he had Tyson Foods and big poultry industry in his district, and he had a lot of problems with the workers not being treated very well down there in Georgia. And so I was working with growers or workers, whether they were the growers of the chickens or whether they worked in the poultry mills where the chickens were slaughtered. So we had something in common between the two of us to defend the people who didn't have a voice. And so then John asked me to come down with him to his district to hold a hearing on the issues surrounding worker rights in the poultry industry, which I did. So we became closer as a result of that.
And that wasn't the only legislative issue you two supported. You voted for DC statehood in 1993, and that was one of his bills, correct?
I think it was one of John's bills, and I think, I remember I was a Republican, and no Republicans were going to vote for that. But I was thinking, actually, having a conversation with John Lewis, but also with Ben Cardin. Ben Cardin and I were in the back of the House chamber while the vote was being taken, and neither one of us had voted yet. And we were having this conversation about what we felt was a real legitimate conversation about the value of Washington, D.C. becoming a state and the justification of it becoming a state because of the citizens in the nation's capital who didn't have a voting member of Congress. So Ben and I just decided, if we lived in D.C., we would want representation, so we voted for it. Now, I was the only Republican that voted for it. And members of my party ran up to me, said, You made a mistake. Change your vote. You made a mistake. And then when I said, nope, I didn't make a mistake, they had this odd look in their face.
And that wasn't the only legislation or legislative agendas you shared with Congressman Lewis. In 2001 and later in 2007, you both co-sponsored legislation to revamp the Army Corps of Engineers, sponsor the High Performance Building Act, and other environmental issues. Tell me about John Lewis's environmental ambitions and legacy.
John Lewis, whether it was social justice or environmental justice, was the voice of people who were ignored, who were mistreated, who were always left out because of the color of their skin or the amount of money they had in their back pocket. So John was their voice. And many of the Corps of Engineers projects and many of the projects with low-income housing used very shoddy material, didn't care about mold, didn't care about repairs, didn't care about who was managing the property. And the Corps of Engineers often conducted projects where they would fix the numbers so the economic justification, the cost-benefit analysis, was favorable to the project, whether it was a good project or not. Now, this is a lot of money that goes into the hands of people who aren't really doing a service for the public. So Lewis was for social justice and environmental justice because he saw environmental justice as the same as social justice, people being treated equal and fairly.
You both hold the distinction of receiving the Edward F. Snyder Award for National Legislative Leadership in Advancing Disarmament and Building Peace from the Friends Committee on National Legislation. In 2007, Congressman Lewis received it for his commitment to nonviolent resistance, both in his work with civil rights and his opposition to the Iraq War. You the next year for your work on Iranian relations and in the Middle East, and your work on disarmament. Tell me about the importance of that award and sharing that with John Lewis.
I think that's the award that I was most proud of. It meant that you were doing your job. It meant you were looking in a powerful way to have a dialogue with potential enemies for peace. And if there's any true or worthwhile goal in public policy, it's to sit down and have a dialogue with people who potentially are considered your enemy for the purpose of peace. And so that, I still remember sitting in that room getting that award, and that was the last year I served in Congress, so that sort of wrapped up my short career in Congress, having it mean something.
What are your thoughts about John Lewis's unfinished business?
You know, everybody's business is unfinished. Frederick Douglass's business is unfinished. Abraham Lincoln's business is unfinished. Harriet Tubman's business is unfinished. Martin Luther King Jr.'s business is unfinished. John Lewis's business is unfinished. It's up to each generation to learn from the past, to learn from people whose goal in life was to find an enemy they could have a dialogue with and reach the goal of peace. So now it's our responsibility. Like Lincoln said, it's up to the living, not to forget the past, but to go on and pursue justice. So John was an exceptional person, and having known him, my life is not only a lot richer, not only more worthwhile, but John had this amazing ability to instill in each individual that he came in contact with a sense of confidence about themselves. That was what he would give you. That was his gift to you, that you felt more confident about yourself, which is a pretty valuable thing to have.